So ladies and gentlemen, at the time of recording, it's now going to be tomorrow when you watch this video. And for me, at the time of recording, yesterday was a UN meeting. And during that UN meeting, Donald Trump and Cyril Ramaphosa both gave addresses. I've got to say, those addresses were bangers. Well, mainly Trump's. I mean, Ramaphosa was just a useless wet fish, and we'll talk about Ramaphosa in a minute. But the entire speech by Donald Trump was a masterclass in dismantling the global order. But it also highlighted very clearly why we have problems with the legacy media. And to be honest, the globalist organizations as a whole. Now, we should probably start off this conversation by talking about the UN. It's important to remember that when the UN was founded, the majority of the states, the founding members of the UN, actually lived in democratic states. Now, this may not seem like an important issue, but it really is, because the UN was founded on the 24th of October, 1945. This was just after the Second World War, and it began with only 51 founding members, which included the US, the UK, the USSR, China, France, and many others. Now, of those original 51 members, 20 to 25 were roughly considered democracies. Now, the rest of them were considered to be monarchies, and a number of them were colonies transitioning into independence. Now, as of today, the UN has 193 members, nearly all of them recognized as sovereign countries, with the newest member being South Sudan, added in 2011. Now, out of those 193 members, only 24 countries are considered to be full democracies. That's full democracies. Of them, 50 are considered to be flawed democracies, meaning that they basically just captured states. We have hybrid regimes and a number of authoritarian regimes, with 83 being authoritarian. Now, just for reference, South Africa is one of those that are considered to be a flawed democracy. In any case, it's important to remember this because when the UN was set up, it was basically set up to stop potential future wars in Europe and to promote democratic norms. This is the idea of the democratic values, if you want to call them that. But the UN is no longer in that phrase. We have really absurd things in the UN, like Iran chairing the Human Rights for Females Forum. We have some really bizarre stuff that when you look at it objectively, you'd look at it and say, well, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. So the UN itself is fundamentally flawed. Now, the UN for some time has been getting involved in a number of very authoritarian programs, and we all know about it. There's things from disarming individuals from their small arms via the Small Arms Treaty. There's the globalist agenda. There's the climate change agenda. There's the green agenda. There's the 2030 agenda. There's like more agendas than I know what to do with. And many of these agendas all have one distinct goal in mind, and that is the subjugation of the people and the capitalization of people. In other words, they want to make you and me basically nothing more than human capital. We don't actually have any intrinsic value in ourselves. We're just capital. Now, yesterday at the UN meeting, Donald Trump obviously addressed the entire forum, and it was fiery at best. When he first arrived, news had been that an individual had suggested that they should sabotage Trump and show him who's boss by turning off the escalators when he was walking up them. And somebody actually did that. Now, Donald Trump, when he went to the podium, he went to go use the teleprompter, and suddenly the teleprompter didn't work. So he actually had to pull out a speech in the old-fashioned way and read it. And he did mention that the entire thing seemed like a darn con job. Now, the first issue that Donald Trump raised was he accused Europe of civilizational suicide. And if you've read anything by Douglas Murray, The Curious Death of Europe, you know this is kind of 100% correct. He says that unchecked migration was destroying nations. He bragged about slashing illegal crossings at the US southern border to a trickle and claiming that Europe must copy the model. Now, he warned that mass immigration would destroy European heritage, and it has, because now we've seen in many European countries that European heritage is classed as colonial and racist and what. And because they have such large numbers of foreign immigrants, many of those individuals don't want anything to do with the nation state's history because that's racist. So you're not allowed to talk about it. And many of those countries are just becoming like beige countries with nothing really going for them. Now, he said that some countries were being invaded like nobody's ever seen before. And if you look at the numbers going into Europe through illegal and legal migration, well, he's not wrong. If you go to Belgium now is the majority foreign. Belgium itself, their own capital, is over 50 to 60% foreign. That's an official statistic. You can go see it for yourself. And this has led some commentators even to go around Belgium and say Belgium feels distinctly like an Arab country.
You might think I'm in Morocco, Algeria, an Arab country. Habibi, this is Belgium. Belgium, Brussels. Brussels has become an Arab country, I'm not gonna lie. It's not Belgium anymore, it's not Europe anymore. Brussels has become an African city, you know? Yeah.
And that's not hyperbole, it's actually 100% correct. And so he called open borders a failed experiment and insisted the death of Europe was looming if leaders didn't act. With reference to climate change, he says it was the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world and dismissed global warming as a hoax. He attacked green energy as a fake catastrophe destroying economies. He told leaders to double down on fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas, and accused Europe of falling into an energy trap. Now, when it came to the recognition of Palestine by Western allies, he called it a reward for Hamas terrorists, which, to be honest, many individuals are saying, including senior Hamas individuals. And I showed you that in the video yesterday. A senior Hamas individual saying it was a reward for October 7th. So Donald Trump isn't saying anything that the Hamas leaders themselves are not saying. Now, he insisted that the only acceptable deal is a ceasefire for hostages exchange and demanding the return of all captives, whether they be alive or dead. Now, he told NATO members to stop buying Russian oil and called them idiots for funding their own enemies. He threatened powerful new tariffs as sanctions on Moscow if allies don't align with Washington, and he endorsed shooting down Russian jets that enter NATO airspace after repeated violations in Estonia, Poland, and Romania. Now, he spoke for nearly an hour, and it was a mix of scripted remarks and a few personal complaints about UN facilities, in other words, the broken escalator, the faulty teleprompter, and he said that the UN itself was in dire need of being revamped. He said that they had already used $2 billion to revamp it. They had done nothing that they could have. He said as when he did the original estimation, it was like 500 million. And so he accused the UN of basically spending money that isn't theirs, it's taxpayer money. And he said that they're all just wasting it on vanity projects. Now, he framed his entire speech as proof his second term is more America first than ever. And this left many allies uneasy, and many allies have supposedly walked away feeling very disgruntled. Afterwards, Trump sat down with many leaders, such as Macron, and told them that their support for Palestine was just complete garbage. And Cyril Ramaphosa took to the stage, and one of the first things he started doing is prattling on about Palestine, to the point where Cyril's microphone actually got cut off, and you can watch that right here.
The much-awaited state of Palestine by 142 nations.
The speaker's microphone has been cut off.
Now, despite Cyril going there and talking absolute nonsense, his speech actually centers around three key points. The first was the reform of the UN, which he said he wanted to see. He said he wanted to see accountability for Israel's genocide in Gaza and urgent climate change action. And he highlighted Africa's disproportionate suffering from climate change. So according to him, Africa doesn't actually contribute anything to global carbon emissions, but according to him, Africa suffers the most when climates change. And it's important to remember, climates throughout history change. This is not unusual. What they're really suggesting is that the climate is changing at an accelerated rate, and this is being caused by global emissions. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. I'm not here to debate that. But in any case, Ramaphosa positions South Africa as a champion of the global South, which is contrasting Trump's nationalistic rejection of multilateralism, because what Ramaphosa really wants to be is a globalist stooge. We've seen this time and time and time again. Now, as the issue of Palestine's statehood and the recognition was such a big part of Ramaphosa's speech, let's actually quickly talk about that. And that is that dozens of countries, which included France, UK, Canada, Australia, and Portugal, formally recognized Palestine at the UN. And if you've seen any of the social media posts, you will notice that Canada, the UK, and wherever else are now classing Jerusalem, including parts that don't belong anywhere near East Jerusalem, as being Palestine. So it really shows you that many of these individuals are just done. But in any case, Macron spearheaded the move, stating that two-state solution must be salvaged before it's too late. And the Palestinian Authority promised reforms, elections, and a ceasefire if recognition is expanded, while Mohammed Abbas demanded full UN membership. Yeah, this isn't going to go good for everybody else, because in other news, it's already been suggested that the Palestinian Authority may sue the British government for $2 trillion in reparations. But I can't verify that. You can let me know what you think of that in the comment section below. Now, Netanyahu accused the West of emboldening Hamas and vowed never to recognize a Palestinian state. He says that Israel is considering annexing parts of the West Bank as retaliation, though Gulf allies like the UAE warn that this could wreck the Abraham Accords. But in retaliation to that, Trump is convening the Muslim-majority nations, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Qatar, to design post-war governance for Gaza. So Trump himself feels that the Gaza situation will be resolved shortly. Now, Washington wants Arab troops on the ground to allow Israel to withdraw and Arab donors to fund reconstruction, which will exclude Hamas. Now, critics call this a thinly veiled attempt to impose external rule on the Palestinians. And they would, but I've got to say, I find this really, really distasteful, because there are many disputed territories around the world. There's northern and southern Cyprus. Should Israel start recognizing the other side's territory as being belonging to them? What about the Falklands? Argentina considers that to be their territory. Should Israel start considering the Falklands as part of Argentina's territory? Because I think they should. Because you see, this is what happens. You can't go into other people's landmass and start dividing their land with other entities and just saying, well, you must give it over to XYZ. But cannot see the ANC ever allowing that to occur in South Africa if the US said, well, you must give the Western Cape to, Rania. Like, they'd have a complete meltdown over it. So this is apparently rules for thee, but not for me. Now, in relation to the ICC, Trump is preparing unprecedented entity sanctions on the entire International Criminal Court for investigating alleged Israeli war crimes. This could include freezing the ICC's banking, payroll, and software systems, which would cripple its operations. ICC staff have already paid their salaries in advance, fearing Washington will follow through. Now, all of this is important because what we're actually seeing is we're seeing a collapse in real time of the idea of multilateralism. This idea of globalism is collapsing before our very eyes, and it's all because of Trump. And all I can say to that is, thank God, because the UN is a horrid organization. Now, in relation to Russia and Ukraine, I've got to say that I was taken a bit by surprise that Trump appears to have reversed his position. Now, he was previously skeptical of backing Kiev. Now, Trump now says that Ukraine should retake all its original territory and maybe even go further. Now, what is maybe go further? I don't know. Maybe he says that they should go and take Russian territory. He branded Russia a paper tiger with a collapsing economy and an army fighting aimlessly. He urged the EU and NATO to bankroll Ukraine's counter-offensive, stressing with time and patience the original borders are very much an option. Now, Trump said NATO must be ready to act against Russian incursions and refused to rule out US forces shooting down Russian planes, especially if they go into NATO territories. Now, his envoy, General Keith Kellogg, warned Russian drone incursions were tests of Western resolve and not accidents, with NATO reiterating its commitment to Article 5, promising to respond with all necessary tools. Now, Zelensky himself was apparently shocked but encouraged by Trump's policy shift and called it a game changer. He says it proves the US is ready to guarantee Ukraine's security post-war, and he noted that Trump had previously humiliated him in a televised spat, but now appears far more supportive, and he emphasized that this could speed up ending the war, providing European funding and NATO airspace defenses keep flowing into Ukraine. Now, this obviously comes weeks just after Trump rolled out the red carpet for Putin in Alaska, now dismissed as meaningless because apparently he got Putin into Alaska, thought they could have an agreement, and he didn't. because this reflects Trump's growing frustration with Moscow's prolonged failures in Ukraine and shifting Western unity against Russia. So what's actually going to happen on that front? I haven't got the Scoobiest. But all of this is important to understand. I've now explained to you exactly what Trump said and what that really meant, and it was really important to see how the legacy media framed Trump's speech. As an example, let's use the Telegraph. Let's actually use a proper newspaper, supposedly, and let's look at the line that says, Mr. Trump, who returned last week from a comparatively passive state visit to Britain, appeared to relish the UN speech as an opportunity to hit out at his opponents, reserving particular scorn for his hosts at the UN. In a meandering address marked by ad-libs, he called his spurned offer to refurbish the UN headquarters in the early 2000s and used it to illustrate what he called the organization's overspending and incompetence. So let's look at their first statement, meandering address. Well, that itself is ad-lib. Also, the idea that it was scornful, that's ad-lib. These aren't factual. Apparently, his audience watched as he bragged about his achievements and berated allies. Also ad-lib. That's not factual. You could say he was just saying very clearly what he had actually achieved. And how do we know this to be true? Well, because the article even says at a later stage, the broken lift and teleprompter served as a metaphor for UN incompetence and overspending. So despite him actually saying this and giving a clear example as to where he thought the money was being abused, apparently the writer of the article still thought to defame Donald Trump's address. And you see, on and on the articles go. Now, you got to start actually reading these things when you see the articles, when we start talking about him meandering, and he's just making unsubstantiated claims and whatever, because what the actual writers in the article are attempting to do is frame the correspondence in a specific way. They're attempting to give you a narrative that will almost lead you as the audience to believe that somehow Trump was just talking nonsense. But in any case, I, for one, am very pleased to see Donald Trump dismantle the UN. And do let me know what you think of that in the comments section below. Turning on then to some other news articles that you might have missed. In other news, at a South Africa-China trade fair, Beijing urged car makers to build factories in South Africa, promising zero tariffs on African imports. Now, China has already invested 11 billion rand in South Africa and apparently supports 400,000 jobs across energy, mining, and tech. Now, the trade between South Africa and China, now $54 billion, is now double what South Africa and the US trade is, showing Pretoria's pivot east, because this is the way South Africa is now moving. It is moving towards the east. Now, you can see that in South Africa's degrading of the Taiwan mission. As you'll know, that Taiwan's embassy or their consulate, or whatever you want to call it in South Africa, they were told to leave Pretoria and go somewhere else because only real countries actually have their embassies there. And you will recall I did some videos on this. Well, Taiwan has now retaliated and they have imposed chip export restrictions on South Africa. So they're not actually going to send South Africa the full quantity of chips that they have before. They're saying they're going to impose limitations. And it's important to remember that Taiwan actually produces the vast majority of global chips. Now, these chips are all vital for automotives, electronics, all industries critical to South Africa's economy. Now, the DA have warned that this could decimate manufacturing and would shed thousands of jobs in South Africa. Pretoria insists that mineral exports, including palladium and platinum, give it leverage, and so somehow they can negotiate with Taiwan. And so they say they're not really that worried. But there are noticeable risks with South Africa losing any form of high-tech competitiveness due to the limitation of chip imports to South Africa. I mean, we've already seen China saying, well, why don't you build some cars in South Africa? This is to offset against American manufacturing that occurs here right now, or Ford and whatever else. But if you can't get chips into the country, well, you might as well not bother building a factory here. Now, that story in itself is a really important story, especially at a time when South Africa's economy isn't doing that great because of Trump's tariffs. So it's going to be really important to see how that actually moves. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that was the speeches of the day. That's the latest news. I've got to say, I loved Trump's speech. Do let me know what you think of it in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.